Thank you very much, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. It is truly an honor for UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti, and me personally, of course, to be here today, together with so many illustrious leaders and thinkers, discussing in-depth issues which concerns us every day. And we have already heard in quite some detail how the COVID pandemic turned into a child rights crisis and reversed achievements towards many of the Sustainable Development Goals, how its impact and responses left millions of children falling deeper into poverty, out of school, and unwillingly uprooted and on the move. So bridging the inequality chasm, so every child everywhere has equal opportunity, remains a distant dream. UNICEF and partners continue to chase that dream in pursuit of the fulfillment of all children's rights. UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti in Florence seeks to provide answers to the impact on children of 2 years of life in lockdown, with school closures and digital learning worldwide. Through evidence generation, we give a voice to children and adolescents who want to be actively involved in a post-pandemic recovery. In the wake of the pandemic, we established new streams of research to analyze the impact of the pandemic in many areas: education, child poverty, social policies, mental health, intersectional violence, and child protection, online and offline. Never before has it been so obvious that the need for more evidence and for new approaches in conducting research and maximizing evidence use for decision and policy making is critical to respond to this as well as to future pandemics and crises. A core research area in our office concerns children's use of digital technology. With the increased access and use of technology by children in most, although not yet all, parts of the world, we recognize that their futures will be influenced and shaped by technology in many ways. And over the past 7 years, we've been designing, leading, and supporting global evidence generation on this topic, and we do so by speaking with children and their families about their experiences in the digital environment. We place children's voices and experiences first and channel those voices into policy and program development to help guide the actions of our organization and partners in government and civil society. So Innocenti has developed and leads 2 of the most comprehensive multinational evidence generation projects in the world in this area. And the first is our Global Kids Online project, which surveys children in the Global South on the risks and opportunities they face online. This is often a valuable starting point for countries that previously have had no evidence to work with. The methodology has been widely adapted and used in more than 40 countries to date by UNICEF and by many of our partners. Our Disrupting Harm project focuses on sexual exploitation and abuse of children through digital technologies, which is one of the most significant harms that children can encounter in the digital realm. Together with our partner organizations in ECPAT and Interpol, Disrupting Harm provides extensive evidence on children's experiences of online sexual exploitation and abuse in a country, and a rigorous assessment of how the national protection system, its legislation and law enforcement is responding to this crime. It's a unique project that has so far been implemented in 13 countries in Africa and Asia, and we plan to continue implementing it in Latin America, Middle East, and the Balkans this year. And it is our hope that eventually this project can also be funded for European countries where quality evidence on the extent of online child sexual exploitation and abuse is still lacking. Today you will hear from one of UNICEF's experts who founded and led these projects and who's continuously contributing to evidence generation on this topic. He'll be speaking to you about how our office responded to the COVID pandemic by doing what we do best, which is to collect data with children and families to understand what they experienced during the pandemic with respect to their use of digital technology and online harms. So I thank you for your time, and I ask that the floor be given to my colleague, Kardefelt Winther, who's online. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gunilla, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just confirm that you can hear me okay? Yes, you can. Fantastic. So it's a pleasure to speak with all of you today. It was great to hear the session earlier today already touch on some of the issues that I will be speaking about. Adult opinions regarding children's use of digital technologies and the internet have for a long time been quite pessimistic. When personal computers, the internet, and gaming consoles were arriving in the homes of families, children were, of course, quick to adopt them, as children often are. But adults worried a great deal about this. They worried that children were no longer going outside to play. They worried that they would lose all of their friends in the physical world, or that they were becoming addicted to technology. And this idea that new technology is harmful, especially to children, is not new. If we look back through the history of technological development, we'll find that with almost every new invention that led to considerable change in society, people were convinced that it would be harmful and threaten children's lives and well-being. And there's a great quote from a parenting magazine that exemplifies this quite well. It reads, and I quote, "Here is a device whose voice is everywhere. We may question the quality of its offering for our children. We may approve or deplore its entertainments and enchantments, but we're powerless to shut it out. It comes into our very homes and captures our children before our very eyes." And I'm sure this quote resonates with a lot of people, and the sentence is really quite representative for the discourse around children's internet use over the past 3 decades. Except the quote is not about the internet. It's about the radio, and it's from a parenting magazine published in 1935. Now, in recent decades, concerns about the negative effects of radio on young people have practically disappeared, but concerns about new technologies have most certainly not. As the COVID pandemic hit, many child rights organizations, experts, law enforcement, or others working to protect children, they rang the alarm bells and said, now that children are going to be stuck indoors and spend more of their time online, they will be much more at risk of online harms than before. And by online harms, I'm talking about issues like exposure to violent content, self-harm content, hate speech, cyberbullying, misuse of personal information and data, and perhaps most severe sexual exploitation and abuse. And while I certainly share the sentiment of protecting children, and while I see clearly in the research that we do that the digital environment can have a harmful effect on some children, it all felt a bit premature. And as with many times in the past, adults were assuming that increased internet use would cause harm to children, but they were assuming it rather than assessing it. And assessing harms associated with technology use is one of the things that we do in our office. And we do it by engaging directly with children and their families. And we continue to expand this form of data collection and evidence generation every year to all parts of the world. And so when the pandemic hit, our first response from Innocenti was to immediately engage in research with families living in lockdown. Working with the European Commission's Joint Research Center and National Academic Institution in Europe, we embarked on an online survey in 11 countries in Europe with more than 6,000 families and children aged between 10 and 18. And we wanted to understand both how the pandemic was impacting the family and their use of technology, but also if children were experiencing more online harms or not. And the results, they were quite revealing. So first, and unsurprisingly, I think everyone knows this by now, we found that the time children spent online more than doubled in most of these countries during the lockdown. Most of this change was driven by digital learning activities. Children were basically attending school online. But this increased the total time spent online by a lot. So clearly, the lockdown brought with it a lot of consequences for how families and children engaged with technology, which I think most people would have expected. But we also learned that not all children were happy with this. And in fact, qualitative research that we conducted in parallel showed that many children were talking about a kind of digital fatigue, They felt that they were spending far too much time in front of screens and they were tired of it. And it was us adults who, frankly, forced them to do it. We made them engage in digital learning, of course, with good intentions. It increased their screen time dramatically. Now, it's easy to say that, well, they were so tired of screens. Why didn't they just stop using it after school? Go and do something else. But we have to remember that in lockdown, digital technology was one of the only ways for children to stay in touch with friends, to remain connected to the world outside. Removing that would have removed any sense of normalcy that they had left. And I think this might have been even more challenging for younger children who in our study reported being more anxious during the pandemic than older children. Telling them to put technology aside, it's not an easy ask to make. The World Health Organization made a good intervention here. They recognized the risk of increased sedentary behavior in lockdown. They recommended families to buy exercise games or to find safe places for children to spend time outdoors, which were good solutions, and also mentioned previously today by Father Zollner. But what about online harms? Did they increase with the increase in internet use as many people expected? I think first it's important to highlight that many children actually did not experience any of the harms that we measured while in lockdown. And just to be clear again, these risks were exposure to violent content or self-harm content, hate speech, cyberbullying, or misuse of personal information and data. We did not focus on sexual exploitation and abuse in this study, though we have done so in other work. But overall, this was good news. And it was roughly in line with what we've seen in other research we've done over the years, that a fairly large proportion of children do not experience online harms regularly. However, the other way to look at it is that a fairly large proportion of children do experience online harms. But did lockdown and increased internet use make a difference? The answer that we found, and I find that this is often the case, and it was also reflected actually just now in Professor Reimer's presentation, is that it kind of depends on who you speak to. So among those children who had experienced online harms during the lockdown, around half said that it happened more frequently than before lockdown. And that's a problem, because it means that we have a large group of children who not only were experiencing a global pandemic with all of its potentially negative consequences, they were also experiencing more harm when spending time online, which during the lockdown was a really important space for children. That's not good. And in other research we've done, we find that it is often the children who are already vulnerable who tend to experience online harms to a greater degree. So this might have actually had a cumulative negative effect. However, around 30 to 40% of children said that it happened, well, they experienced online harms to the same frequency as before. And around 10 to 20% of children, depending on the country, they said it actually happened less frequently. So taken together, it seems as if some children were worse off during the lockdown, while others did not see much of a difference. And some children were actually better off with respect to experiencing online harms. And as we heard earlier today from Kathleen McCartney and her colleague, this seems to largely mirror the experience of children during lockdown overall. Some will have been worse off due to unstable families, lack of friendships, lack of emotional support, complicated living environments, etc. But others might have been better off in some respects, because they got to spend more time with their parents, because digital connectivity mitigated the effects of isolation, perhaps because they were bullied in school, but not necessarily online. And this raises a very important point, which is that those of us who work to protect and support children have to remember that children's life circumstances are very different, and that children are very different, and that even major events, disastrous events like a global pandemic, will affect children differently. And we need to refrain from the instinct to assume that harm is caused to all children equally and in the same way, and let evidence guide our response as far as possible. Because if we are too quick to assume that harm is caused, then we fail to recognize the diversity in children's experiences. And that might mean that we fail to construct an adequate response that serves the needs of all children and that meets them where they are in life. And as adults, that really is one of our main responsibilities. It was good to see that many of our colleagues and partners raised concerns around children's online safety when the pandemic hit. Children were and are continuously being harmed in digital spaces and through the use of digital technology. But it would have been even better if the first reaction was to speak to children about their experiences and to assess through research if and how children were experiencing online harms, rather than assume it would be the case for all children. And in our work to keep children safe online and offline, UNICEF will continue to push for an evidence-informed response that puts children's voices and experiences first. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor.